be a fun reminder. And if you don't know us, well, hopefully it'll help you understand a bit more what we're about. So Montréal en Action, we were founded in 2017 by Balarama Wholeness, and we are a grassroots organization and movement that believe in mobilizing citizens around positive and social change. So we believe that by encouraging Montrealers to take responsibility and take actions on key issues surrounding racism, diversity, inclusion, and equity. So how do we do that? Well, we accomplish that through citizen initiative, through webinars such as this one, through educational content. And by doing all that, we aim to bring awareness and to motivate people in becoming impactful social change maker within their communities. And the community, your community could be the city of Montreal, of course, but it can also be within your family, within your workplace, or even within your group of friends. So basically, we believe in democracy and in taking that democracy in a way of making social change. And that's what we did back in 2018, sorry. We collected 22,000 signatures, forcing the city of Montreal to hold a public consultation on systemic racism and discrimination. The result of that public consultation was a report written by the OCPM, which is l'Office de la Consultation Publique à Montréal. And in that report, you can find 38 recommendations on how to fight systemic racism in Montreal. So that was quite a big accomplishment. And just a fun fact, by doing that, we became the first organization in North America to force a public consultation on racism at a municipal level. So that's what we did from 2018 to 2020. So now what you're probably wondering, now that you guys did that, what are you guys working on? Well, what we're working on right now is holding the city accountable and making sure that those 38 recommendations will be implemented and that they are taken seriously in the hopes of building a city that is more inclusive, more equitable, and more sustainable. And it's with the help of our volunteers, of our partners, and with your support that we'll be able to accomplish that. So thanks a lot for being here tonight. I don't want to take any more of your time because I know you guys are not here to hear me talk. So I'll let the floor to Julie Savarière, who's also a volunteer at Montréal en Action, and she will be introducing our guests. So Julie, the floor is all yours.
Well, thank you very much. Sorry, guys. This is the reality of working from home. With kids running in the background and expressing their discontent. However, it is my great pleasure to be introducing Dr. Afua Cooper. I think many of you may have heard her name or read her book, but she will get more into it during this time together. So first and foremost, my name is Julie Savarière, and I will be the facilitator and your host for some of the talks from Montréal en Action for the Black History Month. I am what I call a Jedi designer. So Jedi not for Star Wars, but Jedi as in justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. So I try to help organizations just raise their justice and equity initiatives. So that's what I do. And hence, that's why the work of Dr. Cooper is so important to me and for all of us, really. So Dr. Afua Cooper is a multidisciplinary scholar, an artist, and a tenured full-time professor at Dalhousie University's Department of Sociology and Social Anthropology with cross appointments in the Department of History and Gender and Women's Studies. She is also a senior academic trained in the history of Black people in Canada and the African diaspora. Her indomitable research on slavery, abolition, freedom, Black education, and women and youth studies has made her one of the leading figures in African Canadian studies. She founded the Black Canadian Studies Association and the Dalhousie Black Faculty and Staff Caucus, and also established the Black and African Diaspora Studies minor at Dalhousie. Her contribution to society includes the literary arts, history, humanities, education, and human and civil rights. And she was recognized in 2015 with the Nova Scotia Human Rights Award from the Nova Scotia Human Rights Commission. Her book that many of you have heard The Hanging of Angelique, The Untold Story of Slavery in Canada, and The Burning of Old Montreal broke new ground in the study of Canadian and Atlantic slavery. Angelique was actually nominated for a Governor General's Award and was named by CBC as one of the best books published in Canada. She also co-authored a book called We're Rooted Here and They Can't Pull Us Up. Love the title, by the way. Essays in African Canadian women's history. And it really helped center the study of Black women's history in Canada. So needless to say that her commitment to social justice education has resulted in her creating many exhibits, number of 8, on Black history, slavery, and freedom. But this is not the only thing that Dr. Cooper does. She's also a recognized poet, a spoken word artist, and a words maestra. And she helped found the dub poetry movement in Canada and popularized dub poetry around the world. She has organized and co-organized 5 international dub poetry festivals in Canada. And she actually also published 5 books of poetry, including the critically acclaimed Copper Woman and other poems. And in fact, Dr. Cooper served as a poet laureate of Halifax Region Municipality for the term of 2018-2020. So in recognizing the tremendous multidisciplinary contributions Dr. Cooper has made to Canadian society and life and internationally, Essence magazine named her as one of the 25 women who are shaping the world. So finally, the impulse behind the work of this multidisciplinary scholar and artist is democratic, and her work really aims to bridge the gap between academia and the world at large. So I think we could go on and on about the accomplishment of Dr. Cooper, but let me just give quickly a little excerpt of what the topic of today's webinar is going to be, and then I'm going to pass the mic to Dr. Cooper. So for tonight, Dr. Cooper will share the story of Marie-Joseph Angélique, who was accused of causing the Great Fire of Montreal in 1734 and then executed. Her story is based on 15 years of research and provides a new perspective on the life of this woman, now considered the first resistance fighter against slavery in Canada. Dr. Cooper will address the issue of slavery in Canada, which has long been invisible to our historians, yet lasted 200 years. And we want to mention that this webinar has been made possible through sponsorship from McGill University's Labor Law and Development Research Laboratory. So Dr. Cooper, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Julie, and for such a warm introduction. And I also want to thank the Montréal in Action, all the team, all members of the team, and a big thank you to Balarama Holness, who contacted me and invited me to present at this forum. And I'd like to thank all members of the audience for coming out. I'm gonna begin by reading an excerpt or two of a poem I wrote on Marie-Joseph Angélique. The poem is called Confessions of a Woman Who Burned Down a Town. I'll read that before I go into the slideshow and the discussion. I buried the twins that evening. They died of smallpox, were only 8 months old. Madame came to the funeral and said to me by way of consolation, C'est la vie. I too have lost my own. I went back to work in Madame's house that same evening, and at supper, she yelled at me and boxed me full in the face because I overturned the gravy bowl in her lap. So the fire happens, Angélique is found guilty. Guilty, the judge pronounced, and the sentence to be tortured, my hands cut off, my body burned, and the ashes scattered to the 4 corners of the earth. I broke down then, my body crumpled in a heap, and before my eyes I see the twins, and they look so alive, as if they're waiting for me to come and nurse them. The sentence is reduced. No, them just going to hang me and then burn my body. And Father Labadie come back for him confession. And I confess, yes, it's I, Marie, who set the fire. I started in Madame's house down by the river. 50 buildings destroyed, the hospital, the cathedral. I said, yes, is I Marie who burned this city. So write that down, Father Labadie. Write down my story so it can be known in a them history. With burning heart, I take the sacrament. I accept the final rites. Outside, the guard is waiting to take me to my hanging. Outside, the guard is waiting to take me to my dying. Outside, the guard is waiting to take me to my burning. And soon, soon, I will be free from the prison of this island, and I will fly and fly and fly. This bright evening, now my work is over, I will fly away home. Little bird, petit oiseau. So obviously, it's a topic that's has been with me for a while, and I've covered it in poetry. I've covered it in well, the book that Julie talks about, The Hanging of Angelique, and I've covered it or presented to the public in other forums. So right now, I've been thinking about how slavery intersects with colonialism. So we'll just look at those slides, because oftentimes we think of slavery and colonialism as two discrete processes, but in fact, they're not. So if we go to the second slide, where we look at a definition of settler colonialism, and in this case for Canada, we're looking at settler colonialism. Canada, in this context, meaning New France. And one definition we have here from Barker and Lohman is that settler colonialism is a distinct type of colonialism that functions through the replacement of indigenous populations with an invasive settler society that develops a distinctive identity and sovereignty. And settler colonialism is in this form of colonialism. The settlers, the people, in this case, people from Europe, they're here to stay. It's not a type of colonialism where you had in other parts of the world, let's say India or Jamaica, where it's more direct rule or indirect rule. And we think of the classic settler colonies as Canada and Australia, New Zealand, United States, and to a lesser degree, South Africa. I mean, this settler colonial theory understandings and practices have been used in colonizing places like Kenya, Uganda, Argentina, Chile, and so forth. So we're dealing with, in Canada, New France was a settler state. We often think that the present moment is, we are living in a manifestation of this context that we're living in happens over several centuries, 5 centuries ago. So New France was a settler state. People came from France to settle. It was first governed by a company of 100 associates being one of them. By 1663, it became a crown colony, ruled directly from France. The governor was sent out, the governor established his council, and so on and so forth, set up the means of governance. But one of the things that we always do is to separate Canada from the rest of the world. Canada is this unique place up there in the north, not interacting with other spaces and territories. But that's not true. Canada was part of North America. It was part of the Atlantic world. And at the period in time in which we're looking, the 18th century, the 17th century, the mercantilism, mercantile capitalism was a dominant economic form that was happening, certainly in the Western world. What drove that? What drove that kind of capitalist expansion was the institution of slavery, was the slave trade from Africa to the New Worlds, and the institution of slavery itself. And all these colonial empires, France, England, and then England morphed into Britain, Portugal, and others were involved in this colonial enterprise, which was underpinned by slavery, by the enslavement of African people. So we look at some of Frantz Fanon's, we'll just go through Frantz Fanon's list, his four phases of colonialism. So oftentimes, again, when we're talking about colonialism today, we seem to forget Frantz Fanon. Frantz Fanon was such a forerunner, or people like Aimé Césaire, and we engage in this discussion as if it's something new. In 1963, Fanon published on his deathbed, really, The Wretched of the Earth, in which he talks about the four phases of colonialism. Fanon, as you know, was involved in the liberation struggles in Algeria. He was from Martinique, went to study in France, joined the French military, went to Algeria, and then left the French military and joined the Algerian freedom fighters. So, I want to invoke his name. I want to think about him in this Black History Month because he has contributed so much to theory. He has contributed so much to the liberation of Black people and all oppressed peoples around the world. So let's move on. Black people and colonialism. Where do Black people fit in all of this? When we talk about colonialism in Canada, for example, where do Black people fit in all of this? Or how does Black people fit into these processes? And I'm saying we must think of enslavement as a colonial event. Within the Americas, slavery was intimately linked to colonialism and vice versa. Black people were brought to North America to labor. So we hear this saying, stolen bodies and stolen land. Black people were brought to North America to labor through the violent process of capture and enslavement. And the raison d'etre of this whole enterprise was to produce wealth for whites, and as important, to build a colonial infrastructure. So within New France, where you had Black enslaved people, their job was to work for white people for free. That's what enslaved people did in those times. You worked for free. You looked after the children, you worked on the farm, you worked in the mines, you rowed the canoe during the fur trade, you packed fur, you did whatever was required of you. So you're here to labor to build up the colonial infrastructure. The slavery was violent, it was brutal, it dehumanized Black people, it subjected them to violence of all sorts, violence in every aspect of their lives. Let's move through, thank you. And so I want to talk about Angelique now. And the next three slides are from the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, Montgomery, Alabama, which is this wonderful memorial to Black people, enslaved African Americans, and even after slavery ended in the Jim Crow period, people who were lynched. And these slides here, or these images, are a graphic representation of the violence of colonial slavery that were wrought on the bodies of Black people. So we can think, we know Marie-Joseph Angelique, for example, came up from the Hudson's Valley. We don't know how she got to North America. We know she came into New France, into Montreal. But when we look at these images, they give us an idea of the kind of dehumanization that happened to Black people within the Americas over the course of 400 years. So metropolitan laws and colonial legislation regulated slavery in New France. And these laws defined enslaved people as chattel, personal property, things, commodities that could be disposed of according to the wishes of their owners. Enslaved persons were thus, in effect, non-human. Yet slave laws had built-in contradictions because those who made and implemented them often recognized the humanity of slaves when certain circumstances demanded it. For example, in Canada, during the Ancien Regime, masters um, often baptized their slaves, served as their godparents, and consented to them having Christian marriages and burials. Another area in which the humanity of slaves was restored was in court. Canadian courts recognized the legal personhood of the enslaved when they committed crimes. The accused were held fully responsible for their deeds and had to bear the punishment meted out to them. Throughout the 130 years of French colonial rule in Canada, enslaved Blacks often faced the magistrates. And one such person was a Portuguese born slave woman, Marie Joseph Angelique. This bondswoman would have disappeared into obscurity had it not been for the fire that occurred in Montreal on the evening of April 10th, 1734. Accused of setting this fire, Angelique was arrested, thrown in prison, and later hauled before the Montreal judges. During the 2 month trial that she endured, she was made to feel the full weight of the king's justice. Her case was heard before the lower court in Montreal and the high court, that's the Court of Appeal, in Quebec, the seat of the colony. The court proceedings were recorded for posterity. And so that's how we know about her. They recorded the court proceedings. They kept, they made copies of it. They kept the copies. They sent the original to France. Angelique Court's records provided us with an opportunity to see how justice was dispensed in the case of an enslaved person charged with a capital crime. She was charged with arson, it was a capital crime, meaning punishable by death. The trial transcript also served another function. They reminded us that, and I quote, slaves were neither the anonymous perpetrator nor the hapless victims of the slave system. And these documents, unquote, these documents show them to be men and women with distinct personalities. And that's from a book by, the quote is from a book by Peter Hoffer in his publication, The Great New York Conspiracy. The book was published in 2003. So in December 1734, Angelique asked her mistress, Madame Thérèse de Coin de Francheville. Sir Francheville had died the month prior. Sir Francheville died in November 1733. So in December of the same year, Angelique asked her mistress for her freedom. And Madame refused. And later the slave woman learned that her mistress had sold her to a Quebec merchant. We leave the slide right there as it is, this one. That's fine. So we learned that her mistress had sold her to a Quebec merchant, or she learned. Angelique then went on a reign of terror in the household. She threatened to burn her mistress and make her pay. Now, in February of the following year, that is February 1734, Angelique ran away from Montreal in the company of one Claude Thibault, an indentured laborer from France, who was also in the employ of Madame de Francheville. Thibault and Angelique were also lovers. The couple was intent on making it to a port in New York or New England. I think it's more New York. And from there, a ship bound for Europe. Angelique's intention was to return to Portugal, the land of her birth, and Thibault to France. However, they were caught after 2 weeks and returned to Montreal. Angelique was sent back to her mistress's house, or to her mistress, and Thibault was lodged in prison. He was released from prison on the 8th of April. Remember, the fire happened 2 days later. And upon his release, Thibault visited Angelique at Madame Francheville's house, though the latter had forbidden him to ever set foot in her house again. On 10th April, the house caught fire, and the flames quickly spread to the neighboring building. After the flames cooled, citizens discovered that 43 buildings in total, including the city's hospital, the Hotel Dieu, had been destroyed by the fire. Suspecting that arson um, was the reason for the fire, Angelique, Montreal was out for blood. The following day, the constables arrested Angelique. She endured a 2-month trial and on 21st June was executed by hanging. To this day, no one is not sure if Angelique set the fire. Though she confessed to doing so, she did this under torture. There were other suspects, most notably Angelique's lover and co-conspirator, Claude Thibault. But by the time Angelique was arrested, Thibault had vanished into thin air. And in thinking about the time, I'll just skip this section and go on to the, the verdict and the punishment. So as I said, she endured this 2-month trial in Montreal in the lower court. And if you look at this slide, her first interrogation by the judge, Judge Rainbow, interrogated as to her name. How do we know that she's from Portugal? We know she's from Portugal because at the first, her first appearance before the court, she was put through this question and answer process where she had to give a biography of herself. If we could just read it, there's a black sort of rectangular box on the slide. So if we can we offer the opportunity no, if we could go back to the slide where she's interrogated. Anyhow, as I said in the court, the scribe, she's asked these questions. She tells her biography. She said she's from, she was born in Portugal, and she ended up in New York, in Albany, New York, where she was owned by a Flemish man, a Dutchman. It makes sense, and you may ask me why during the question and answer period. She stayed with the Flemish man or the Dutchman for about 9 years, and in 1725, she was taken up to Montreal to be the slave of Sir Francheville. And so she gives all of that information in her interrogation during the trial. And that continued for 2 months. She was found guilty. But you know, they have this mechanism at that time, this legal mechanism that anyone who was found guilty and sentenced to die had to have the case appealed to the higher court, to Le Conseil Supérieur, which is the highest court in the land. So Angelique was taken by boat to Quebec City to face the judges of what I'm gonna call the Supreme Court. They found her guilty, but they modified the sentence. The lower court in Montreal said they condemned her to death. Her body was they were gonna burn her, cut off her hand, and thus she would die. The upper court felt that punishment was too gruesome, so they modified it. They said, okay, we'll just hang her, and then after which we'll burn the body and then scatter the ashes into the four winds. And that's exactly what happened on June 21st. You can see the slide there. The year 1734, the 20th of June, 3 in the afternoon, it should be 21st June. The present judgment was read to me, the undersigned clerk, at the goal of the city, at the jail of the city, to the accused, And after the sacrament of repentance was administered to her by Monsieur Nevetier, priest of Saint Sulpice Seminary, she was remanded forthwith into the hands of the executor of the High Court. Think of that. Think of the violent language. Who brought her before the door of the parish church, where she made honorable amends, a torch in her fist, and then was led by the same executor. So ritual, the performance of death, this performance of punishment. The undersigned clerk is a man named Portlier. He is the clerk of the court, the scribe. So she's is found guilty. She's taken back to Montreal. She is going to be tortured. The executioner is also the torturer, the man who will hang her. They're gonna parade her in a cart, in a rubbish cart around the city. She's gonna hold a burning torch in her hand. She's gonna beg pardon of the king, of the people, and of justice. And she's gonna do that in front of the cathedral, Notre Dame. And then she's gonna be taken to a space down in the area where the fire happened, where the gallows are going to be constructed, and from there she will be hanged. Huh. She was hanged and strangled and then thrown into the fire, and the ashes cast into the wind in execution of the said judgment, dated the said day and year aforementioned. So let's go back. I'm going to talk about the confession. I said earlier on when I started that she confessed. I just want to say the person doesn't have to be. What's showing up on my screen is a black rectangular box, and it's sort of, it blocks out some of the words. So, we'll just move to the next slide. It's okay. So she was, the court system in New France is that once you're hauled before the judges, you're guilty. You have to prove your innocence. In theory, in English common law, you are innocent until proven guilty. In colonial New France, it was the reverse. You're guilty. You have to prove your innocence, and you have to prove your innocence through articulate speech. You have to speak strongly on your behalf. You have to say why you're not guilty. You have to say why you're innocent. But Montreal had decided from the get-go that Angelique was guilty. And so nothing she said, even though she said I didn't do it, would change their mind. The city was burnt. It was costing them, lots and lots of money. It was also going to cost the metropolitan government lots of money to rebuild. She had burnt, or let's say the fire had burnt a lot of people out of house and home, and they were not happy. They wanted blood. One author talks about, Peter Hoffer, he talks about punishment in the 18th century, and I quote, "In the 18th century, colonial punishments were all about the display of state power on one hand and the performance of the convicts on the other." He further notes that when the slaves confessed, they submitted themselves wholly to the authority of the state. All the rituals of punishment, including corporal punishment and capital punishments, sent a message to the spectator that the state was all powerful and must be obeyed. So back to the point of the confession. Angelique confessed under torture. And the torture was this gruesome procedure called le brodequin, in which they basically break your legs. They tie it around your feet with these, pieces of planks, pieces of wood, and with a big hammer, they come down on your leg and break it, and the blood is oozing out and the marrow is oozing out. On the first round of this torture, la question ordinaire, she confessed to setting the fire. But they gave her a second round of torture. And then she said, I did it alone. Thibault wasn't involved. It was me. A devil came into me. I did set the fire. Um, the the person who was doing the torture was none other than Matthew Levey, who was a slave of the crown, an enslaved man from Martinique. He was a maroon in Martinique. He was a fugitive. He had escaped from slavery 3 times. On his third attempt, he was caught, he was rounded up, and he was going to be executed because this was his third attempt. New France needed a hangman. New France needed an executor. And so the metropolitan government, through the governor of Canada, New France, and the governor of Martinique, got Levy. The Canadians, they wrote down and they said, we need an executioner. The governor of Martinique said, well, we have this slave who we're going to hang. Why don't we send him up to Quebec and he can be the hangman? That often happened. In colonies like Louisiana and Saint Domingue, sometimes the executioner were enslaved men who were going to die. And this, well, I guess you could call it an opportunity was presented to them. Either you die or you become the executioner, the hangman. And some refused. Matthew Levey was 24 years old. Maybe he felt he could do it. But he was a slave of the crown. The government owned him. And so he was the executioner. No. So she's tortured. This public display that Hoffa talks about, this the slave on bended knee, or the convicted person on bended knee holding this torch. This is, straight out of um, the medieval France, their whole torture process. It's straight out of medieval France, and it continued up to the modern period, even in the 18th century. The Hoffer further notes that, and I quote, to reinforce that message, the state resorted to the most gruesome punishments. The message that the state is powerful and must be obeyed, and it, as Douglas Say talks about this terror to evildoers. So you're gonna have this gruesome punishment, which is the state displaying its power. By this logic, slaves who had the least to lose, and this is important, slaves who had the least to lose were made to suffer the most hideous punishments. Angelique's punishment and her performance in the streets of Montreal were meant to shock and awe potential wrongdoers, slaves in particular, who were seen as natural enemies of their own households and the state. Yet the judgment and the sentence that the court in New France handed down in Angelique's case could not be otherwise. In their minds, she had destroyed property. Property, the fire destroyed the economic hub of the city. Many families had been burnt out of house and home and had lost all their furniture and personal effects. The government had to find tens of thousands of livres to pay for the damages caused by the fire. This was perhaps the most important criminal case the judge Pierre Rimbaud had presided over, and he could not allow it to be said that he was soft on the accused. Everyone, from governor to judge to soldier to citizen, was calling for blood, and someone had to pay. There was no way out for the enslaved woman. The same law that deemed her property now recognized her as human and called upon her to bear full responsibility for her alleged crime. The slave woman had no defense other than, I didn't do it, and no one believed her. Moreover, she had not endeared herself to anyone. She was an enslaved woman who did not know her place. Marie-Joseph Angelique had acted as if she was free from authority. And in New France, no one, not even a free person or an aristocrat, was free from authority. New France was a paternalistic and hierarchical society, and there was always a higher authority to which one must bow. Slaves and servants obeyed masters, children obeyed parents, especially fathers, wives obeyed husbands, and everyone obeyed the laws of the government and the church. Everyone except the king had a natural superior on earth, and anyone who claimed to be free from authority was a threat to public order. That's a quote. I'll give you the source from it later on. In Judge Rainbow's mind, Angelique had challenged and showed utter disregard for the authority of her mistress and of society. In fact, she had mocked authority. As a result, and this is from their perspective, she became out of control and a menace to society. For that, she had to be brought in line and disciplined. The preamble to the 1670 Criminal Ordinance of Louis XIV's Coutume de Paris, the legal code of France, which was also enacted in New France, began by stating that, and I quote, criminal justice restrains by fear of punishment those who are not restrained by a consideration of their duty. And this is from Peter Mook's book, La Nouvelle France, that quote. And the quote before is also from that book. Angelique had to be restrained by punishment because consideration of her duty had failed to restrain her. Let's now look at some of the slides. Here we have a person. It's an illustration of someone doing making honorable amends, which is where you go down on your knees. And imagine her knees would have been um, injured from the torture. So there's a man, a priest or someone from the church helping this person because someone had to help you. This person would have undergone the torture. Someone had to help you go down on your knees to beg pardon of God, of the people, and of justice. Let's move to the next one. This is not Angelique, it's a painting or a drawing of a woman called Amy Spain. It's a young enslaved woman. She was 17 in the from Texas. She was hanged by Confederate soldiers. But I put it there as an illustration to say, you know, Black women, enslaved Black women, were not given the kind of masculine or patriarchal protection that white women, that the state provided to white women, even poor white women. Um, let's keep going. St. Sulpice Seminary, I'm sure many people know this building, know this seminary. The priest who gave Angelique the last rites was Father Nevetier. He was a priest from St. Sulpice. Um, the seminary has been around for several centuries, and the Sulpicians were the original seigneurs of Montreal. The history of Montreal is at the Sulpician Seminary. Let's keep going. You know, we talk about law, how slavery was recognized in law, how enslaved people were possessions, how they were objects, how they were things. And as new as this, the territory that we're speaking of, the colonial space, as it moved from one colonial authority or from the hands of one colonial authority to the other, in this case, from France to Britain at the time of conquest. And the French, the Canadians, they inserted or, you know, this article, this clause in the capitulation treaty that they would still own their property because there is this fear that the British were going to confiscate their enslaved property. Well, that wasn't going to happen. The British was a big slave trading power. They could have, though. And they said, okay, no problem. We'll insert this clause. Your Negroes and your Pawnee, who are indigenous people, they will remain your slave. This status was protected, was recognized and protected by law. And so this is when I talk about how slavery is intimately interwoven with colonialism, because as a territory, in the language or from the perspective of the white settlers as it changed hands, this was important to them. Their enslaved property wasn't important to them. And when the British took over, and we're not going to go into that period, and the area became British North America, um, slavery, the enslavement of Africans actually expanded because the British in 1760 had emerged as the world's largest slaveholders and the most powerful military and naval power, certainly in the Western world, and the biggest slave traders, the biggest slave dealers. Even within the 18th century alone, Britain transferred over 3 million enslaved people to this part of the world. So um, so this, this clause here shows how important slavery was to both sides. The recognition of slavery was to both sides, and that it was the enslavement um, later on in the overall French imperial world, and certainly in the British imperial world, the enslavement of Africans that drove that drove capitalism, really. One of the first slides we had was spoke to Olivier Lejeune, and I put it there because he's considered Canada's first enslaved African. Well, we don't know if he's the first. He's the first for whom we have records, for whom we have a document. And Father Lejeune, Father Paul Lejeune, who was the superior general for the Jesuits, he writes about this young boy, about 8 or 9 years old, from Madagascar, that he was teaching him his catechism. So I put that slide there to contextualize this whole discussion. And I just want to give a recognition to this book by Webster, AKA Aline Jai, Le Grand de Sable, um, which tells a story through poetry of young Olivier Lejeune. It's illustrated by Valmont. It's a new book, and people can read it. It gives us another insight into this whole history of enslavement in Canada. So I think I'll just let's move through the slides quickly because there might be something I want to speak to, and then we'll end
Doc-
there.
Yes, thank you. So, Dr. Cooper, just to be mindful of time, we're almost done, and I just want to give a little 5 minutes for people
Oh,
to ask their question. So,
okay.
just a little reminder.
Okay. So thank you very much. C'est tout. Merci beaucoup.
Okay. Did you want to say anything to close off? I didn't want to cut you right into it. I just wanted to be mindful of the time.
Okay. No, I just want us to be aware. I wanted to start thinking about why Black people were brought to the New World, so called, and it was to labor. And part of the reason why we have this, vicious anti-Black racism today, all over North America, all over the world, is because the ideas that we had about Black people that were developed during the period of enslavement are still with us. There hasn't been a psychological intervention in white psychology. I mean, obviously it's not the same today as it was in slavery, but many of the patterns are still the same today. That is why we still keep having Black people being murdered, mass incarceration of Black people. It's as if when the various emancipations happened within the minds of those who ruled society, um, there was this denial still that Black people should be equal citizens, should be free, should be able to live a life free from fear. And so again, to underscore the intimate link between slavery, between enslavement and colonialism within the land space that we call Canada.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Cooper. I'm sure we can speak about this for hours. There's so much to unpack in the history and in the intricacies between, like you mentioned, the effect of colonialism with the economy and really the growth of Canada as we know it today. So thank you so much for unveiling some facts that many people may not know about this time and about the country and the province where we live currently. So we will extend the question period a little bit. So I have already here a couple of questions. So the first one that I would love to ask you is from Sarah Robinson here, and she wrote, "You studied the history surrounding Angelique for 15 years. Did you know about her history before you started, or did you come across it in archives? And also, when did you first read about her and realize how important she is to the history of slavery in Canada?"
Thank you. I first read about Angelique when I was doing my undergraduate degree at U of T, University of Toronto, which was a long time ago. I went to an exhibit that was put on by the Ontario Black History Society, and they had this little panel, this tiny thing. I mean, their focus was on Ontario, but they expanded it a bit, and they had this little panel on Angelique. I'm like, whoa! I was shocked. Slavery in Canada, because the whole Underground Railroad narrative that we're all fed. And nothing's wrong with that. The Underground Railroad did happen. Thousands of people did come up to Canada and gain freedom and so on. But it's the only thing that we know about. And it casts Canada in this white savior light. But here was a story that's saying this enslaved woman was executed for setting fire to a city. And then what further fascinated me was the fact that, she wasn't from Africa or she wasn't from the southern United States. She said she was from Portugal. And then, uh, cut long story short, really points to the transnational dimensions of Black people's history, of our stories, of our wanderings, of our journeys. And so that just really got me thinking. And I really wanted to know more. I wanted to know more about these dimensions, these multiple dimensions. This woman who was in Orange. Orange, it was a Dutch name for Albany, New York, and in Montreal, and the whole story around the fur trade. Her owners were fur traders. And so, yeah.
Well, thank you. This definitely came across my mind as well. I don't think we talk about Angelique enough, that's for sure. So another question here from Aiden Ferguson is just to ask about, so for white colonialists, it was innocent until proven guilty, but for African Americans, it was guilty until proven innocent at that time?
Not necessarily. I mean, depends which context we're looking at. In New France, whoever you were, if you were accused of a crime, it was up to you to prove that you're innocent. You're guilty. You're guilty from the get-go. From the moment the magistrates come for you, you're guilty. I said in the English colonies, in English common law, you are innocent theoretically until proven guilty. When you're slaves in the English colonies, I mean, there was hardly any court system for enslaved people. There was for white people. I mean, they would just drag enslaved people and string them up and kill them in the English colonies, which included what is now the United States. So, but in many of the Catholic colonies, there was this kind of um, this attention to the law. Maybe it came out of the Catholic Church. This idea that you can't just string people up; you have to go through the court system. I think that was what's happening in here. Um, you know, no, I mean, in places like United States and Jamaica, if a slave was if you take some of the slave revolts, for example, in whatever colony, not necessarily English colony, French colony, Portuguese colony, and they send out the militia or the members of the constabulary and capture the the rebels. They may lodge them in jail for a while, but they're going to hang them the next day or shortly after. It's it's interesting because, on one hand they said enslaved people are things, they're commodities, they're brutes, they're half human, they're not fully human, two-thirds human, one-third human, whatever. But when it came to crime or to the court system, then suddenly they're human and they're responsible for the crime that they're accused of.
Thank you very much for your answer. So we have a question here from Jacques Daphne. And the question is that I heard that one of the reasons the slavery in Canada wasn't as massive as in other countries is because the climate didn't allow the same highly profitable cultures as further south. Is this true? And if so, how do we know about this?
Yes, I think there's some truth in that for for what is Canada, New France, and British North America. There is some truth in that, but it's not totally true. And here's why. In New France, and when I say New France, I'm actually speaking about the St. Lawrence colony, because New France extended all the way to Wisconsin, to the west, and all the way south to Louisiana. So, there was New France, Canada, Acadia, and then the St. Lawrence colony. So we're talking about this St. Lawrence colony. There weren't many white people here either. There weren't. There's a part in my discussion that I left out where that is why they sent the Daughters of the King, Les Filles du Roi, in 1663 or thereabout, to help to populate the colony. The king paid their dowries, they ship them over to Canada, they find men to marry, have children, and get population for the colony. There weren't tons of white people. And that was, at the time of the conquest in 1760, there were only something like 60,000 white settlers, or 55,000, maybe 60,000 if you count the enslaved population, right? The population in New France were indigenous populations. They were the majority. In terms of the settler population, it wasn't a lot. So there might not have tons of slaves running around. The white population that controlled the settlerdom was a small population too. Remember, Voltaire said that Canada was a few acres of snow. The French were more interested in Martinique and Guadeloupe and Haiti, those colonies that they were they were growing stupendously rich from. I mean, it was like their wealth from those places was insane, right? The wealth that one slave in Saint-Domingue produced, the wealth that one slave in Saint-Domingue produced, supported 8 people in France. So it's not like, white people from France were rushing to come to Canada. So when you look at the letters from the various intendants to the king, one intendant toward the end of the 17th century, Champigny, the governor was Denonville, they were saying to the king, give us permission to import Africans directly from Africa. And, basically, and more people from France should come. So what the enslaved population did was in line with the economic activity that was dominant in the colony, which was, the main one was fur trading and then farming, right? So you find many enslaved men who were canoeists in the fur trade. You find women Black women as enslaved people who worked on farms, who worked in the households. But we can't think of Canada as being just off by itself as this discrete entity. Remember, Angelique's mistress, Madame Therese de Coin, sold her before she died, had sold her to a merchant in Quebec City, Cugnet, who it was stated was going to sell her down to the French West Indies. There was always intercourse between the various colonial territories, right? So when you read Kenneth Donovan's article, Slaves and Their Owners in Ile Royale, which is in Acadia, in today's Cape Breton, l'Acadie, the French colonists in Ile Royale were importing enslaved people from the West Indies and also from New England. So, um, and we have to think of slavery as an expanded thing. It wasn't just about, you know, producing staples wherever, in this case in Canada, because people in Ile Royale were engaged in the fish trade, and the fish, the salted fish, was used to feed the enslaved people in the West Indies. The enslaved people produced sugar, coffee, cocoa, rum, etc. That came up to these parts. That came up to New France. So when the sugar that people were using in New France and the rum that they were drinking were produced by slaves in another colony.
Thank you so much for this answer. And maybe following up on this, so you mentioned you mentioned the trades and you know, the salted fish, etc. So one of the questions here is, can you speak more about the links between Black enslaved people and Indigenous people? What were the relations between Indigenous and Black people at that time?
Well, I mean, the slide that we showed there, um, on the 47th article of capitulation, is we can begin with that slide, because it says the Canadians, then when people talk about the Canadians, there was only one Canadians, it was the French. Nowadays in 2021, you talk about the Canadians, French Canadians, English Canadians. Les Canadiens were the French people. They were the only Canadians, right? So that is why it says, the article, it says the Canadians can keep their slaves. The Pawnee, I see someone asks what's a Pawnee. Pawnee were First Nation enslaved people who came not from the St. Lawrence colony. Most of them tended to come from farther west, like Wisconsin side, Michigan, le Pays d'en haut, the upper country to Montreal. So the clause says the Canadians are free to keep their Negroes and their Pawnees, right? So if you look from very early, these two groups of people were suffered from colonial violence and from colonial oppression. So that's one example I would give. Sometimes there were moments of solidarity, instances of solidarity. Sometimes they were not. One of the witnesses against Angelique was Pawnee, Marie Manon, who said, yeah, I know she did it. She called her mistress a bitch. She told me she was going to burn her mistress alive. So she, those are individual acts. And at that time, too, in 1734, as I said before, Indigenous people were still, in many ways, the masters of the land. The settlers were kind of huddled in Montreal, Trois-Rivières, and in Quebec City, and perhaps Detroit, and Louisiana, maybe. Um, in a wider scale, in a broader context, we know that during let me put it another way, when many enslaved people escaped from slavery in, like, say, the Detroit area, they were often given support by First Nations people, whether the reserve system was established then or not. During the Underground Railroad period, we know many enslaved people received assistance from indigenous communities. Before that era, yes, there are visual representations of Black people joining First Nations communities and, becoming part of the tribe. And I just want to say, if you go further south and think of the Seminole people of Florida, the Seminole people was like a mixed race tribe, Really, there were so many Black people who had joined the Seminole tribe and who had become Seminoles, that when the Seminoles were uprooted from the Florida area by Andrew Jackson and pushed toward Oklahoma, what you're seeing were like tons of Black people in that tribe. So that's it for now. I mean, it's a big topic, um, and there's literature on it.
Thank you so much. And there's a question here from Sarah Robinson, where she asks, so would you say that Angelique is the first documented resistance fighter against slavery in Canada? And also a follow-up question around what do you think we can learn from the past in terms of how to resist and dismantle systemic racism today? What kind of parallel can we draw from what you learn as a historian and what can be applied to our situation today?
Thank you. So Angelique's situation was, in the time frame, it's early, it's 1734. Slavery was a mature institution in North America and in the Americas. Why we, she's not the first enslaved person to have tried escaping from slavery. Obviously, there were others before her. We can even think of Olivier Lejeune as engaging in resistance when he said to when Father Lejeune baptized him and said, well, you and I are one, we're equal before God, we're spiritual brothers. And Olivier Lejeune said, really? I don't think so. You're Black, you're white, and I'm Black. I must have my skin taken off to be like you. So, whoa, this is a clever child. He knew that, okay, we may have spiritual equality, but we certainly don't have social equality. I'm a slave and you're not. You can even change my name because the child was called Olivier Lejeune after, at least the last name after the priest. But what we have in Angelique is that her story as an enslaved woman was written down, you know, pages and pages and pages of the not the confession, of the trial documents. And then the intendant um, had to write about what was happening in the colony, and he wrote a big document and sent it to Paris. The Minister of Marine, they had to know, the king had to know. He said the fire was caused because of the wickedness of this negress owned by Madame Francheville. So she took up a lot of space, certainly in the colonial writings and the documents that were sent off to France that year. A lot of those documents are about Angelique. Um, and the colonists themselves, they also wrote letters. They also wrote petitions asking for help from the king. I mean, it's the king's ministers. The king never would read them. It's ministers, but it's addressed to the king. Dozens of letters from the colonists that were also sent across the ocean, saying, we need help. This negress has ruined us. Um, so that's how I would answer it. Angelique was certainly a fighter against slavery. She certainly challenged the slave system. She ran away more than once. As I've said elsewhere, she was a slave, but she did not have a servile mind. And she verbally challenged her mistress all the time. This to me was how she restored her humanity, how she claimed humanity for herself.
Thank you so much. Just to let you know, we're gonna go for another 5 minutes. We're having a lot of very interesting questions. I hope that it is okay with you, Dr.
Yeah,
Cooper.
it's fine with
Okay.
me.
Okay, perfect. Um, so I guess we can have maybe two questions. So the first question, well, the first to the last question I want to ask you is regarding of your book. So the Hanging of Angelique, did you face a lot of pushback when you released it? Because it really lifted the veil on slavery in Canada for many. And if so, did you experience any pushback when you released the book?
I can't say I received any pushback because people can't deny it. It's not as if Afua Cooper is making up this story. The story, the fire happened, there was a trial, the woman was tortured, she was executed. The intendant and all his officials wrote about it and sent the documents of the or copies of the documents to France. So those are facts. What people people in the media, ordinary people, anyone, what they would say, because someone talks about the Canadian conceit. Canadians want, and when I say Canadians, this time I mean francophone and anglophone and allophones. um, that they always want to invoke the Underground Railroad
Mhm.
narrative. So they would say, "Oh yeah, slavery happened here, but it wasn't so bad. It was mild." So that was their way of comforting themselves that they're not bad people, because it's and again it's a way of denying in my understanding, the way I see it, it's denying Black humanity. It's their refusal, it's people's refusal to identify with, or to recognize rather, Black pain. It's always denying Black pain. Yes, there was slavery, but it wasn't so bad because the slave ate beef or something like that. People have a hard time in empathizing with Black people. A hard time. I mean, it took the murder, the public execution of George Floyd, before some of the same people who were denying racism, who were denying the atrocities of slavery. It took the public execution of this man on TV in a camera, a camera recording it, before they could say, "Oh yeah, things are bad. Blacks have it hard." So it's this Canadian conceit that's rolled out every time, or that's expressed when people talk about when we talk about slavery. It's like, "Oh, but it's not so bad, you know." Well, one woman ended up being hanged and her body burned, and the ashes cast to the four winds, right?
Mm. Thank you so much. This was very powerful. I'm sure many people in the audience must have felt the same thing from that I felt. And my last question for you, and I'm sure you were probably asked this question, but do you think that Angelique was really guilty, and is the answer really matter? Does it matter at this point, right? Is
Well,
it really important?
yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure it matters at this time.
Mhm.
Whether I personally, I think she did it. I think she did it. But from a legal point of view, there are lawyers in the audience or law professors. They'll sit on the fence, right? Because they'll say the evidence isn't conclusive. And so that's the thing. If she was around today, well, maybe she would still be found guilty today, because she's Black. That's it. Anti-Black racism. Even if she had the best lawyer, she probably would be found guilty today. Um, but I don't think today they would bring a 5-year-old child in court, which they did that then. No, it's what I want to get at, and what I want people to understand, is the brutality of slavery. And that's what drove enslaved people and people in bondage to fight back, right? If slavery was so nice, remember that before the insurrection in Sandama happened, like weeks before it happened, the white planters were sitting on their verandas and they were saying, "Oh, our slaves are happy. They're fine. They're content." They were saying that. It's incredible. In a place where they said it was hell on earth, the white planters were saying our slaves are happy, right?
Mhm.
It's a cognitive dissonance. And then the insurrection, burst out, and the rest they say is history. So, but the point I'm trying to get at is that people, enslaved people throughout the Americas, fought, whether they engaged in a big insurrection that became the Haitian Revolution, or they killed the cattle of their owners, or they poisoned their owners, or they burned down their owner's house, or they whatever they did, they fought back. There was always this challenge to slavery. They challenged slavery. They resisted. So why would Angelique not do that? This woman had been sold so many times. In fact, when she found out that her mistress had sold her to Kunier in Quebec City, she begged her. She said, Madam, I'm going to behave myself. Please don't sell me. I don't want to be sold again. Right? So you think of the black body as this article of commerce that's been sold and traded all, around the place, all around the Atlantic, all over the world. And she didn't want to be sold again. At the same time, she was still planning to escape and make it back to Portugal, which in my mind tells me that maybe she was free in Portugal, right? And when Madame said, "No, you're out of here. I'm done with you," she said, "Okay, bitch." Well, really, she did say bitch. I'm
Yeah.
not la chienne. She said, "You're a bitch, and I'm gonna burn you, right? I'm gonna roast you." And she would tell people, "I'm gonna burn that bitch." Burn that bitch. That sounds like the title of a poem. Um, and so why wouldn't she, if she thought she had nothing to lose? If she thought she had lost everything already, why wouldn't she? Slavery drives people mad. Slavery was, a lot of people think, oh, well, slavery was so mild in Canada. What is slavery? It's denying you your humanity. It's taking away your children. It's committing, as I talked about at the beginning of the talk, about all the kinds of violence that were meted out to Black people. And one type of this violence was reproductive violence. It's stealing your children. It's saying you don't even own your children, and when you give birth to them, you don't own them. The master owns them, or the mistress owns them. Why would slaves, who are human beings, why would they not push back? And push back they did, and Angelique was one of those people.
Definitely. I think the big messages that I'm getting here is that one, with your book and the data that you presented, Canada was forced to deal with its angel complex that it has over so many topics in its history, and that we should be inspired by the fire that our ancestors had, and the courage and persistence that Angelique displayed up until the very end. So
Yeah, thank you. And you guys, Montreal in Action, are continuing that tradition, because to get thousands of petitions and forcing the city to do this investigation is just fabulous. That's so powerful.
thank you so much. And thank you so much, Dr. Cooper, for sharing your wisdom and your knowledge with us. It was incredible. And I think everybody agrees from what I see here. There's so many thank yous in the chat. So I'm going to pass it off to Montréal en Action again, to Nadège, to close it off. But really, from the bottom of my heart, thank you so much.
You're most welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. And again, thank you, Dr. Cooper. As Julie said, we have so many comments in the chat, people saying, thank you, your work is so enlightening. So thanks again for being with us tonight. And before we let you go, everyone, we just wanted to let you know what our next webinar will be next week. So next Tuesday at 6 p.m., we're having our second webinar with the amazing Webster and Rito Joseph. And during that webinar, they will give us a history lesson on the African heritage in Quebec. So just make sure to register to our website if you want to attend. It's next Tuesday, February 9th at 6 p.m. We want to also to take the time to say thank you to our partners. Without them, this wouldn't be possible. So we want to say thank you to the Department of Canadian Heritage, Colors of COVID, the Overture with the Arts, the Peace Network, the McGill School of Continuing Studies, and the Black Law Student Association of McGill. So thanks to all of them. And lastly, if you want to know more about us and stay and know more about the 38 recommendation and our Black History Month lineup, you can visit our website, montrealenaction.com. You can also follow us on social media. We have Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. So just keep liking our content, keep sharing our content and commenting. And don't hesitate to slide in our DMs and send us a little message. We're always happy to hear from you and exchange with you. And if you can make a donation to our GoFundMe, that would be very appreciated. It doesn't have to be a big donation. It could be $1, $2, $3. Every dollar counts, and every penny will help us doing what we do. And your support is always very much appreciated. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Cooper. Thank you, Julie. And to everyone who asked questions and was present with us today, thank you very much. And we hope to see you next week. Bye, everyone.
Thank you, guys. Thanks,
Bye. Have a
everyone,
good
and good night.
Have a good
good
evening.
night. Have a good evening.
You
you.
too.